Once upon a time, in a peaceful town nestled between rolling hills, there lived a family known for their kindness, happiness, and success. The Clarks, as they were called, lived in a large, beautiful house at the end of a quiet street. The house, with its ivy-covered walls and a wide, welcoming porch, seemed like something out of a storybook. The family's life was a picture of contentment. Mr. Clark, a successful lawyer, was a man of integrity and charm. His deep voice carried confidence, and he always had a kind word for anyone he met. Mrs. Clark, on the other hand, was a loving homemaker whose soft laughter filled the house like a melody. She was known for her culinary skills, always preparing delicious meals that made their home a warm haven for friends and family. Together, they had 2 children, Tom, a bright and energetic 10-year-old boy, and his younger sister, Honor, who was 8. Tom's wide, curious eyes and Honor's playful smile were a reflection of their joyful spirits. The Clark family was inseparable. Every evening, the house buzzed with activity, Tom running through the halls after his friends, Honor practicing her piano, and Mrs. Clark preparing a hearty dinner, while Mr. Clark worked late into the evening in his study. It was a symphony of ordinary, everyday moments, each one contributing to the harmony of their home. Every Sunday, Mr. Clark would gather his family for outings. They would go to the lake, where Tom and Honor would run barefoot along the shore, their laughter echoing across the water. Sometimes they would visit a nearby park, where they would picnic, play games, and tell stories beneath the shade of old oak trees. Their family was the epitome of happiness, and their life seemed perfect. But one cold winter morning, the world the Clarks knew came crashing down. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the window, casting a soft glow over the house. It was a quiet morning, the kind that promised a peaceful day ahead. But peace was a fragile thing, easily shattered. Mrs. Clark, though still recovering from a slight cold, was rushing around the house. Tom had a school project due, and she was trying to help him gather the materials he needed. She had a pile of papers in her arms, but in her haste, she didn't see the last step on the staircase. Her foot slipped, and she tumbled down the stairs with a sickening thud. "Mom!" Tom screamed, his heart pounding in his chest. He dashed to her side, his small hands trembling as he tried to help her up. His mind raced. This wasn't just a normal fall. He could tell by the way she winced in pain that something was terribly wrong. I can't move, Tom," Mrs. Clark whispered, her face pale. Tom's heart froze as he knelt beside her, his hands shaking. He ran to his father's study, shouting for help. "Dad, Mom's hurt," he cried, his voice breaking. Mr. Clark's face went pale as he rushed upstairs, his mind racing. He knelt beside his wife, fear and worry clouding his thoughts. "Jill, can you hear me? Are you okay?" His voice was shaky as he gently tried to lift her. I think my back is." "I can't move," Mrs. Clark managed to say, her eyes filled with panic. Without wasting another moment, Mr. Clark lifted her carefully and they rushed to the hospital. After several tests, the doctor delivered the devastating news. She has injured her back badly. She will need complete bed rest for at least 6 months, possibly longer. Her recovery will be slow and uncertain. Mr. Clark felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. His strong, capable wife was now fragile and dependent on others. His mind raced. How would they cope without her? How would the children manage? In the days that followed, the Clark family's once perfect life began to unravel. Mr. Clark tried to maintain his composure, but he was overwhelmed. He worked long hours at his firm, and when he was home, he struggled to keep the house in order. Tom, though only 10, did his best to help. He tried to clean, to look after Honor, to do whatever he could, but he was still just a child. Honor, who had always been content playing the piano, now found herself taking on responsibilities she wasn't prepared for. She attempted to cook, but the food was often burnt or tasteless, leaving them with empty stomachs. The house was in chaos. The laundry piled up, dishes remained unwashed, and the once warm kitchen was empty. The air felt heavy with tension and exhaustion. Tom and Honor were trying their best, but they were both just children, too young to carry such a weight. "I can't do this," Mr. Clark confessed one evening, his voice hollow. He stood in the middle of the cluttered kitchen, staring at the mess that had accumulated. "I can't manage everything on my own." After much thought, Mr. Clark decided to hire help. A few days later, Clara, a woman in her early 30s, arrived at their home. She was kind and efficient, with a soft smile that immediately put the children at ease. She took over the cooking, cleaning, and laundry, bringing some semblance of order back to the household. Tom and Honor felt a brief relief finally, someone who could handle the tasks they couldn't manage. At first, it seemed like the perfect solution. Clara cooked meals that were flavorful and filling, and the house began to sparkle again. But it wasn't long before something felt off. Tom began to notice small, strange things, like how Clara would linger at the dinner table, eating with their father as if she were part of the family. He saw the way she would sit too close to Mr. Clark, laughing and talking in a way that made him feel uneasy. It wasn't just the meals or the chores, something in the atmosphere had shifted. Honor, who had always been intuitive, began to pick up on the changes too. Her father had become more distant, retreating to his office more often or spending time with Clara when he was home. The family dinners that had once been full of lively conversation now felt awkward and strained. It was as if a wedge had been driven between them. The children, who had once felt like they were at the center of their parents' world, now felt invisible. They cared for their mother, who was still bedridden, but the absence of their father's attention left a void that was hard to fill. Mrs. Clark, too, noticed the shift. She missed the days when they would sit together as a family, sharing stories and laughter. But she said nothing, too exhausted and in too much pain to address it. As time passed, the tension in the household only grew. One evening, Tom overheard a conversation that would shatter everything. He had been walking down the hallway when he heard Clara's voice, raised in frustration. "I can't keep doing this," Clara said, her tone sharp. "I'm tired of being just the maid. I've been serving your wife and children for so long, and it's not enough. I need more. I need something more from you. I can't spend my whole life as a servant of your family. This is being unfair to me." Tom froze, his heart pounding. He edged closer to the door, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. "Clara, we'll figure it out," Mr. Clark said, his voice low. "You've been a great help, but I can't leave them. They're my family." Tom's stomach churned as he pieced the conversation together. He pushed the door open and walked into the room, his voice trembling. "Dad, what's going on? What did she mean by that?" Mr. Clark looked up, his face flushing with embarrassment. For a moment, he was silent, but then he sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Tom, I married Clara. We've been married for some time now." Tom's world seemed to spin out of control. His father had married Clara, the woman who had come to their house to help when their mother was ill. Tom's heart shattered as the pieces of their life fell apart. Honor entered the room just then, having overheard the conversation. "What? You married Clara?" she said, her voice trembling with disbelief. "How could you do this to Mom? To us?" Mr. Clark looked down, guilt written all over his face. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said softly. It just happened." The truth was a heavy blow, one that would take time for the children to process. They were left reeling with the reality that their father had moved on, leaving their mother behind in her time of need. Tom and Honor didn't know how to break the news to their mother. She was still recovering, and they couldn't bear the thought of adding to her pain. But as the days went by, they realized they couldn't keep the secret any longer. It was eating them up from the inside. One evening, after dinner, they sat beside their mother's bed. Tom, his voice trembling, said, "Mom, we have to tell you something. It's about Dad and Clara." Mrs. Clark looked up at them, her face a mix of confusion and concern. "What about them?" Tom swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. "Dad married Clara. He's been living with her for months now." Honor's voice broke as she added, "We didn't want to tell you, but we couldn't keep it from you." Mrs. Clark's face went pale, her expression unreadable. The news hit her like a punch to the gut. She stared at her children, unable to process what they were saying. How could her husband, the man she had spent so many years with, betray her like this? How could he leave her, of all people, when she needed him the most? For the first time in weeks, Mrs. Clark broke down. Her tears flowed freely as the betrayal took root in her heart. She felt lost, abandoned, and utterly heartbroken. The months that followed were filled with grief, confusion, and a painful sense of betrayal. Tom and Honor struggled with their emotions, torn between their love for their mother and the growing resentment they felt toward their father. Mr. Clark, despite his promises, had been absent emotionally. He was more focused on his new life with Clara than on repairing the broken bond with his children. His relationship with Clara grew more public, and the kids found themselves isolated in a way they never thought possible. But over time, things began to shift. Tom, now 15, took a part-time job as a waiter to help support the family. He worked long hours after school, studying hard to ensure a better future for himself and Honor. Despite the emotional scars, Honor found solace in helping her mother around the house. They supported each other, forming a bond stronger than ever. Mrs. Clark, though deeply hurt, found strength in her children. She knew that, no matter what, they would always have each other. The days were often difficult, but the love between them grew stronger with each passing day. Years passed. Tom graduated from high school and began working in a local office. Honor finished college and became a teacher. Though their past was full of pain, they managed to build a new life. Mrs. Clark, still recovering from her emotional wounds, found peace in the love of her children. Finally, Tom and Honor, both brother and sister, decided to take legal action against their father. They sued him for their rightful share of the family's assets, and after a long, painful legal battle, finally they won. They were finally free. The three of them moved into a new home, one filled with love, hope, and the laughter of a family reunited. They had survived the storm and emerged stronger than ever before. Their story was one of struggle, but also of resilience, and in the end, they found happiness once again. Together, they knew that even in the darkest times, the light of family would always shine through. And so, the Clark family lived happily ever after.